My name is Anita Gurumurthy. I'm one of the co-organizers. I come from an organization that's called IT for Change. We meet today at the historic milestone of the WSIS plus 20 United Nations General Assembly high-level meeting on the sidelines to discuss protecting economic, social, and cultural rights in the digital age with a spotlight on the right to food. I just have to also say that there are two stalwarts on the panel with me today, and they are from Third World Network and from FIAN International, and both the organizations have been at the forefront of economic, social, and cultural rights, speaking on behalf of the Global South for several decades now. So it's an honor and pleasure to have them at this WSIS discussion. I also wanted to say that Giulietta Rossi from the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights sends her regret, and she's not able to join us, unfortunately, but we shall certainly be able to transmit the insights of this discussion to her. Friends, I think this is a sobering moment, and just a couple of days ago, the World Inequality Report 2026 was released. And for those of us who haven't yet seen the report, I do encourage you to do so, but don't take it to bed. You will not be able to sleep. The report explores new dimensions of inequality that define the 21st century. It refers to climate, wealth, gender disparities, unequal access to human capital, the asymmetries of the global financial system, the territorial divides that are redrawing democratic politics. So this kind of confluence of politics and economics to a point that we're not able to tell one from the other. And all of these themes reveal that inequality today is not confined to income or wealth. It affects every domain of economic and social life. And I will just give you one statistics and spare you of the rest. The top 10% in the world own 3/4 of global wealth, while the bottom half holds only 2%. And I dare say that this reality has much to do with the digital context. We had thought back then, and I did go to Geneva in 2003 during the WSIS, and then subsequently to Tunis in 2005. We had thought back then, and quite naively, that information and communication technologies would equalize our world. We believed that the war against want was going to end. We believed that informational democracy was indeed possible, and it would lead to greater accountabilities and better distributed justice. But here we are, as digital technologies reshape our world, their impact on fundamental human rights, especially the right to food, remains largely unaddressed. And we'll see why in the conversation that we hope we can have today, not just with the experts, but also yourselves. And at the end of the conversation, we're hoping that I, as moderator, will be able to unmute those of you who would like to really contribute to the debate. What the evidence is telling us is that platform capitalism, and permit me to set the stage for the debate before we hear from the experts. I'd just take a couple of minutes to give you a context as to why we would like the digital conversation to include something as foundational, as fundamental as the right to food. And the connection is really in platform capitalism. So we see that what evidence points to is that platform capitalism has found a new frontier to annex social surplus, which is, of course, the social commons of data. Building on network effects, large corporations, whether it's in the food sector or the pharma sector or the digital sector, have managed to build extractive models. This is familiar territory to most of us. But what is really of concern, and in the past 4 years, 5 years after the pandemic, social movements, which are now better informed, indigenous people that are better informed, are telling us that local knowledge is being usurped, traditional practices are being usurped. Simple things like drones, simple things like cameras, on the field, where crops are grown. And all of these are being codified through AI into patented products. So local knowledge is really being appropriated to channel, patents into the larger business of big tech. And this combines all kinds of data, environmental data, social data, human information. And this is very similar even in the field of health, right? Not just clinical data, but non-clinical data is also aggregated to create a new genre of structural inequality. So this is really the kind of inequality that the new report talks about that's sitting on top of a datafied universe. Meanwhile, I think what is significant is also that governments are trying to use these technologies, data and AI technologies and platform technologies, to really enable local development. And I think it's important to scrutinize, especially for the Global South, whether these initiatives, agricultural data exchanges, for instance, farm-to-table platforms, which need to be regulated and governed, how are they faring? And coming from our experience, IT for Change has really studied these initiatives, and we find that agricultural data exchanges, the European Union, for instance, is also one of the forerunners in these initiatives, health data exchange, agri-data exchange. What all of these experiments bring to the center stage is questions for communities and peasants in the Global South. So how should consent mechanisms be designed in these data exchanges? After all, the interest is not really about one large farmer, like it would be in certain countries in North America, for instance, right? In the context of the Global South, we have myriad, we have multiple, innumerable small holdings. And very often, these are patches of land that are just subsistence cultivation, and with some small surplus. So how do we actually look at consent in these data exchanges? Who gives the consent? Is consent individualistic? Do our data protection laws really cover for the reality of these peasants and these livelihoods? How can producers be safeguarded from private value capture? The idea of these data exchanges to open up data in the name of innovation is really somewhat misdirected, and I'll tell you why. What the evidence is telling us is that private entities in agricultural data value chains have done little to address structural and contextual questions of productivity, soil degradation, water conservation, etc. They have, through venture capital, put money into the logistics layer, farm to table models that simply don't do much for the local economy, right? So in fact, studies in Africa, that Open Knowledge Institute has done, for instance, tell you that women who used to take produce to markets have now been displaced, and male farmers have taken over negotiations with these platform companies. So women's access to the marketplace, women's access to livelihoods is also being curtailed. And these are very, very important social, cascading social effects of these kind of platform economies. I'd also like to make one last point before I open it up, and then we can come back and have a dialogue, that very often in the South, even in countries like India, which have traditionally had sophisticated data systems, census systems, we find that data sets, historic and legacy data sets in relation to land, are not well-rounded. For example, in one state in India, land parcel data does not really exist in all its accuracy, right? So what is land parcel data? It is about records of boundaries, land characteristics, and this is not available. So if you put data on the agri-data stack, and if you invite insurance companies to target different people or fertilizer companies to target different farmers, without any awareness of what land characteristics, soil characteristics, boundaries, land parcels, what would it really imply? What would it also imply for government-directed subsidies, for instance, for who should get how much, etc.? So what then all of this ends up doing, to cut a long story short, is a kind of a predatory targeting of small farmers, marginal farmers, who are already reeling under the weight of debt by unregulated microinsurance companies. So the idea that tech can provide informational democracy, knowledge autonomy, and enrich the edges is something that we really need to interrogate. And I really don't want to end this stage setting on a kind of a negative note, not at all. What I'd like to say is that another or an alternate technological design is possible. So we'll come to that as well. But for now, I think this kind of loss of autonomy, biopiracy, knowledge theft, land dispossession, market manipulation, and all of this in relation to the kind of inequality that the World Inequality Report talks about needs to be interrogated. And I'd like to therefore now invite two stalwarts, people whose work I always reference as my lodestone, Chi Yokling, Executive Director of Third World Network, and Sofia Monsalve Suarez, Senior Advisor from FIAN International, to really share their views. I'll start with Sofia. Sofia, I'd really like to understand from FIAN International's work, what do we know about the impacts of digitalization on the right to food and connected rights? Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Anita, and good day, good afternoon, good morning to the persons that have joined us today. Yes, I would like to present some of our research work in terms of understanding the impacts of digitalization on the right to food and connected rights, and I brought a presentation that I will share with you. So let me see, where is it? Okay. So let me put the presentation mode. Can you see that? Yeah?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Yes. So first of all, I would like to start saying that it is very important to place economic, social, and cultural rights at the center of the regulatory frameworks, but also the design of these technologies, because so far what we are seeing is that there is concern with human rights, but mainly focused on privacy rights, personal rights, which of course all these things are very important, surveillance issues, security issues, and all of that. But what we see also in the human rights community, but also in the UN human rights system, is disregard and neglect of the consequences of these technologies on economic, social, and cultural rights. So therefore, I think it is very important to put to these issues much more attention. So this is the first message. And the second message is that we see that these technologies are not deployed in a vacuum, right? So they are now being deployed in a very specific context, which is very much characterized by what Anita started saying in the introduction to this webinar, namely huge inequalities in food systems. And we have other structural issues which have been shaping inequalities in food systems, but also human rights violations in food systems. And therefore, it is very important to ask ourselves whether these digital technologies are changing anything in terms of these structural drivers of the unsustainability, the unhealthy food systems, or not. Because what we are seeing is that in the discussions on the transformation of food systems, we hear that digital technologies are a silver bullet to solve all sorts of issues, just with this magic stick to change, to democratize information and to make everything much more efficient. But what we see is that they are being deployed actually to sharpen an already extremely unequal structure in terms of access to resources, for instance, subsidies, and so on. So therefore, I would like to start saying, more or less stressing the message that Anita has shared at the beginning, that what we see is that big tech is reshaping agribusiness and is reshaping also food systems in a way which is deepening these strong inequalities. So therefore, I have here a picture how to see how the agribusiness corporations like Bayer, Corteva, Syngenta Group are actually merging or finding ways to cooperate with very large tech companies, as those in the slide. And this is a very concerning development because we already have an extremely concentrated concentrated markets in several parts of the food systems. So if you take, for instance, commercial seeds, we see that just 4 of the companies worldwide control more or less half of the market. The case is the same for pesticides. Of course, the shares vary, but there is oligopoly in structures in different parts of food systems. If you take inputs, that is the picture. If you take retailing, is a very similar picture. So we have already a very concentrated market power in different parts of the food systems. And if you look at the political economy of digital technologies, you will see that the concentration is even higher. Because very few companies control, for instance, 3/4 of world's cloud computing power, and so on and so forth. So this is an extremely worrying development, because what we clearly see is that digital technologies are being introduced in food systems and agribusiness to further concentrate the market power of these companies. So this is an example how this is happening. If you take, for instance, the digital platform Field from Bayer, this allows them to extract data from roughly 80 million hectares in 23 countries, and these data are stored in 2 of the largest clouds of the US tech corporations. Now, I want to focus my presentation today on the case of land. Land is also an extremely concentrated resource. We know this figure that just 1% of farms control 70% of the farmland worldwide. So we have a serious problem with land concentration in our food systems today. This is a problem that tends to be neglected, tends to be not addressed, not put at the center of our policies in terms of how to overcome this extreme land concentration. Land is extremely important for having access to food, and that is extremely important. A decentralized land tenure is extremely important to ensure that our localized food systems are sustainable and are just. So therefore, this is the structural problem that we have in food systems today, land concentration. And therefore, I picked the example of land to see how the introduction of digital technologies for digital land registries is impacting the right to land. Here, FIAN did research in several countries trying to see how the digitalization of land registries is impacting the right to land, whether this new technology to formalize, which is used to make more efficient and apparently more transparent information in terms of land property, land control, how is it being used and what are the impacts. But what we can see is that in several countries, in the countries that we looked into, like Brazil, Indonesia, Georgia, India, and Rwanda, these processes are actually replicating the very same patterns of discrimination and exclusion that used to be before the introduction of these technologies. So this is exacerbating the marginalization of certain rural communities, particularly those communities with customary rights or non-formalized rights to land, also with overlapping lands. That is the case, for instance, of pastoralist communities, which have actually use rights, and how these particularly collective tenure rights are particularly discriminated against when these technologies are introduced. So this is, I have already addressed that. This is, I think, particularly important. Of course, there is a series of drivers which are responsible for the land squeeze or for the land concentration and land dispossession worldwide. Certainly, the privatization of tenure systems and the individualization of these systems and the formalization in order to have very vibrant land markets is one of these factors. Because for investors, it's very important to have have identified which are the most interesting pieces of lands worldwide and how they can invest in those lands. So you probably remember that during the financial crisis in 2008 and 9, a huge wave of land grabbing was sparked because many powerful investors like asset management companies, pension funds, were looking for safe havens for their investments. And this has created an enormous interest for investing in land. So in that sense, land has become data for global investors with different digital tools. They can collect this information, sensors, for instance, drones, also to have information around soil, water. Also, land prices are very important. And they can collect all this data so that land transforms into a digital investable asset that they can control remotely. There is also the risk of power abuses because these virtual transactions enable online land deals. You have heard about blockchain technology being used, for instance, for land transactions. So that we are seeing now a pattern where the control over this data actually equates a control over land. And this creates, of course, new risks for abuse because the actors who have access to this technology, who control this technology, are in a position of exercising control over pieces of land. In the case of Brazil, for instance, we saw how the rural and environmental cadastre who was introduced in Brazil not for actually registering property, but actually for registering the forest areas and areas, of course, that are supposed to be reserved and are under protection. This cadastre has been used actually by very powerful investors to actually prove of control of these lands and to some extent exercise property rights over these lands. But these lands were used actually by communities, but these communities didn't have access to this register to register also their claims over these lands. So this is the type of disputes that the digitalization of land records are creating. So what we see is an amplification of the corporate power. Data analysis systems are used to optimize global land investments. And here we have two examples. For instance, the Aladdin system that BlackRock uses to process vast land data, to calculate risk and returns, to expand corporate resource control. And then the other example that we have seen is FIO's geospatial platform. So this is a tool which is combining different data sets and data layers that FIO has. And it's being used in the Hand-in-Hand initiative, which is one of the flagship programs of FIO, as a tool for matchmaking investors and countries. So in all this, in the introduction of these new technologies for land registries, we don't see neither participation of these constituencies of affected communities nor mechanisms for accountability where they can actually assert their rights or complain about possible abuses. So this is one of the main problems of all these programs, that they are done without social participation and social monitoring and accountability programs. Before I enter into another example, which is related to carbon markets, I also want to say that the environmental impacts of the whole digital technology and infrastructure are huge. We all know now the information around the needs for water and land. These data centers, the cloud centers, all of them need enormous amounts of water, but also need land. So this is one form how they are competing with the needs of local communities for resources like land and water, which are necessary for food production. On the other hand, the race for rare earths and mining is also increasing. And again, this is another driver of land dispossession, and therefore we can see that the very material needs of this technology and this industry is yet again competing with resources which are necessary for the survival of the people. Okay, now I want to look into the example of carbon markets and digital platforms. Together with the Latin American movement for agroecology in Colombia, we did some research on the ground on the impacts of the platforms that are trying to engage small scaleholders, in this case, coffee growers in Colombia, to sell, participate in carbon credit schemes. And this is a case in Colombia, as I said, where, it's called Asombrate, this program. And it's supposed, as I was saying, to connect the smallholder farmers with global carbon markets. It was started by the Rabobank, which is based in the Netherlands. Also with the assistance of an NGO called Solidaridad. This NGO is the one supposed to do all the reach out to small scale farmers. And the promise of participating in these programs was to create additional income for coffee and cocoa growers, and also to promote agroforestry. The participation of farmers was through a digital platform called Acorn. And in our research, what we did was interview farmers and peasants participating in this program to understand whether their rights have been observed or not, and what they perceived as the main problems with this program. So what we found out is that there is a huge lack of information and transparency because some of the people, the farmers participating in this program, had signed forms of consent in terms of data sharing. But many others did not sign any forms of consent. It is also very difficult to understand what are exactly the terms and the conditions for this sharing of information and the contracts for these carbon credits, because farmers don't have sufficient information about all these conditions. For instance, they don't know what exactly is the method of calculation of carbon storage in their lands, and they don't know how this is, of course, let's say, monetized in terms of whether the benefits that they are getting are actually equally distributed to other actors in this whole scheme. So information about this is it was impossible to get. And in fact, the farmers did not get that information in the contracts that they received. And it was not possible to get that information on request, talking to the technical people behind this program in Colombia, because this information is actually only in the Netherlands. It is completely unclear what happens with the personal and farm data of the farmers that are participating in this program. And here again, there is a lack of independent complaint mechanisms if people participating in these programs have complaints. So the other concerning aspect, the other concerning aspect here is that the companies behind these carbon markets programs may be impairing the autonomy of farmers in terms of how to run their farms, because they start stimulating peasants openly or implicitly to change their farming practices so that they can increase the carbon sequestration on their lands. So this is, we think, problematic because there were already reports saying that they have started, for instance, cutting certain trees, certain types of trees, because apparently other types of trees are sequestering more carbon. And this is where we see that these companies are in a position to influence which farming practices will be happening on these farms, and probably disregarding the autonomy about the management and the knowledge of these farmers in managing their lands. Okay, so this is I presented some of the findings of our research, basically showing how one of the most one of the biggest structural problems that we have in food systems today, which is responsible for poverty, food insecurity, but also problems of environmental destruction, all related to land, how the digitalization of land policy, which is, of course, a formalization of security of tenure rights, is impairing the right to food. There are other examples related to, for instance, digital sequence informations when it comes to the right to seeds, but I wanted to highlight today only the case of land. And here, I think our recommendations go, again, it is not wise to separate the structural problems that we have in food systems, like, for instance, land concentration, and to separate those from, let's say, completely consider the use of technologies in an abstract form or in a vacuum. If we want to use digital technologies, it should be to improve equality in access for land, to, for instance, use for redistributive purposes. It should be to overcome these structural inequalities, to transform the food systems, the industrial food systems that we have today, towards agroecological farming practices, towards food sovereignty, and towards real respect of the right to food. So I think that this is a very important message. It is not good to address these problems in a fragmented way. We don't think that it is about just having a checklist so that the algorithms, for instance, of certain programs and processes are just designed in a manner which will be compliant with rights. No, I think that the substance of the political economy, of the technological, but also of the food systems is what needs to be transformed. And I think this is for us a very important issue. Then, of course, it is important to recognize the rights of peasants, the rights of indigenous peoples and other rural workers, women, as data subjects. We don't see that this is necessarily that this is happening at all. So therefore, it is a very important step as well. Intersectional approaches as well. I think that the gender impacts of all these programs are actually overlooked and neglected. And finally, the importance of upholding the right to free, prior, and informed consent, particularly in all geospatial platforms that are used by governments, but also by UN institutions like the FIO. So I would stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sophia. I really think that the idea of sovereignty that we're talking about, whether it is individual sovereignty as an abstract idea that, let's say, the digital personal data protection laws try to grapple with, or the idea of sovereignty as we associate it with something as fundamental as food. These are very, very complex, and they are entirely societal, and they are part of these relational ecosystems where power is a reality. And you spoke about industrial food systems and the wider context of the corporatization of food itself. So our tech regimes and our tech policy regimes are just trying to tweak, this idea of sovereignty and falling short. So what do we really do to preserve and protect sovereignty in its complex meaning, I think, is one of the questions that you raise. And thank you very much for that. I'd now like to turn to an important issue, which is connected very much to the fact of transnational value chains that, Sophia, you raised by calling upon Yokeling to speak to this question about trade and just make a couple of points in relation to, where I come from. And, just the past couple of days, India is in intense conversations with the US government. And the trade deal or the imminent trade deal is stuck at a very important point. India has refused to allow American agricultural products into the Indian market, and the government believes that permitting US farm goods will increase competitive pressure on domestic farmers, and that will have cascading effects on the income and livelihood of farmers. But I think the idea of agricultural trade is complicated by data services in agriculture, and that's something that we really have to cast the spotlight on. For the very first time in a recently signed agreement with the UK, the Indian government opened up its open data sets in agriculture. So the open data sets in all sectors, but open data sets for a long time, many governments have taken a very conservative attitude. They have waited because the idea that digital services in all these core sectors, will be helpful has also been contested by the question of who will benefit when tech firms that offer services like precision farming, right, precision agriculture, AI, analytics, to farmers in the global south, who will benefit, right? It seemed like a no-brainer. I do really hope that we can in the next 4 to 5 years figure out that it's actually helped Indian farmers. But I think that what we need to look at when we look at trade is the broader idea of how digital trade is being shaped and how these agreements could infringe on social, economic, and cultural rights. For a very long time, I think we've been concerned about cross-border data flows and civic rights and privacy and freedoms, to be specific. But I think what is at stake also is the whole domain of social, economic, and cultural rights. And with that, I'd like to really hand over to the expert in the room. Yokeling, over to you.
Thanks, Anita, and don't use the word expert so much. If you don't mind, could you just share screen because I'm having a bit of a problem at my end. Yeah.
Yeah, will do. Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, thank you everyone for coming. I know across the continents it's very early for some of you and very late for others, especially in the Asian region. So as Anita alluded to in the beginning, and what we heard from Sophia, the right to food in all its ecosystem and manifestations is very linked to political economy. It is really moving further and further away from land, from soil, from water, from seeds, and very importantly, at the center of it all, from the knowledge of communities to work the seeds and to work in the very local environment. And I think this
Sorry
is
to
one of the...
interrupt you,
Sorry,
Yokeling.
yeah.
I think my
You're having a
system,
problem?
yes, my system does not work very well with PPTX, but I'm happy to give permission to anybody else that can open
Okay,
the
sorry,
system.
because I had a bit of a problem. What if I converted it into a PDF file? Would that be
Then
happy?
I could do it.
Okay,
I'd be happy to do
sorry.
it. Yes.
So
Thank
maybe,
you.
okay, sorry everyone for this. I should have done it early on. Okay, I've sent it to you. Right, maybe just a little bit of sort of background while we get the screen shared. I think it's really important. I think from what we heard from Sophia, it is so obvious that agriculture has moved away so much from how it should be done And while we also see, agroecology, farm systems that are diverse, beginning to be much more appreciated at the ground level, it is not reflected in policy. In fact, a lot of the policies are moving in the opposite direction, and a lot of the dynamic defending of existing farm systems, and also the bringing together of the new knowledge systems with tradition and time-tested knowledge and practices. That part of it is happening despite, frankly, policy environments which are not enabling. You see having a problem, Anita?
I'm just putting
Sorry
the
about that.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sharing it.
Yeah, and I think that is the background within which we see the corporatization and concentration that Sophia talked about. And the example was just on land, and it actually applies to the entire food chain from the farm.
Are you able to see it now?
Yeah, I can see it. Can others see it? Okay. All right. So basically, I'm going to really look at the sort of external environment at the global level, and more recently with the current U.S. administration, the use of bilateral agreements to basically reshape everything in our society, which impacts on human rights across the board. There's also a lot of unilateral sanctions that we have as civil society, perhaps in our different spaces of work, experienced it when you're living in a country under broad sanctions. You get cut off from medical supplies, you can cut off from very basic raw materials, you can get cut off from having to be able to export your surplus in your food systems. So unilateral sanctions, which are illegal under international law, but increasingly being used, are actually being spread across the world, where entire countries are blacklisted by powerful, governments. So I want to just take us through a little bit of the context within which we have to think about technology and about our advocacy. So what is happening to human rights if we look at the area of these so-called trade agreements? When we all started looking at these agreements back in the day, when we think about trade, even now, most of us would think that trade means goods, right? We're buying and selling goods. You were exporting between countries, and we could be trading in the local markets. Trade is not something that is new. However, the trade in goods, as the world has become globalized, where starting with the colonial period, where we were kind of divided into the supplier of raw materials, whether it's minerals or forest or human labor, and then we are taught ideas like comparative advantage. You are better off producing cheap goods or supplying raw materials. Technology added, value added will stay in the hands of those who are industrialized. So this creation of inequality in terms of who holds resources, which is real wealth, who has labor, important human resource, who has technology to turn the resources into products and to provide services. This, if the holding of these modes of production and factors of production is not democratic, not equal, not fair, then you begin to see what we have today, which is inequality of deep wealth, as Anita introduced us to at the beginning of this discussion, but rooted because there is deep inequality on who develops and controls technology and knowledge and data. So if we look at the area of trade agreements, it has really moved from the traditional, when it starts across borders about trade in goods, to in the last maybe 30 to 40 years, the so-called notion of what we call comprehensive economic partnerships, investments agreements that were becoming broader, and the word partnership became the word, which sounded rather innocuous. But what it means really is that the scope of trade agreements began to be wider and wider, and they're still called trade agreements. But if you look at the documents, they are about not just goods. Goods will just be a small percentage of the entire agreement. There are chapters on services, which is everything that you cannot drop physically is a service. It could be a environmental service. It could be services provided in your food supply chain. It could be, services around retail. So we're talking about so many architecture, professional services. And then there's always a separate chapter just on financial services, which is targeted at opening up our economy so that capital flow can go in and out. You don't regulate how money comes in and out, and you exposes your society, your economy to a lot of financial risk. And then there's an investment chapter, which created more and more rights for private corporations, which are foreign working in a country. And the rights of investors, foreign investors, became so dominant that human rights was constantly actually put on the sideline. And then you have government procurement, which is a very important part of every society, every country's ability to use government procurement, whether it's from food to building hospitals, to building bridges, infrastructure, schools, providing services, because that's the biggest part of government spending. And that is the spending that can also be used as a tool for us to develop and promote our own local industries, our local farms, our local farms for food production. And so government procurement is a very important tool for all governments to ensure that your spending stays in the economy. You only import and buy what you cannot produce, and then you learn and you go up the technology chain and your ability to produce. And so this is a very important part. Opening up government procurement contracts to foreign companies is a big part of what these agreements are about. And then we saw the introduction of e-commerce chapters in these trade agreements. And most people used to think it's rather harmless. It's about platforms. It's about buying on Amazon, or in this region, Lazada or Shopee. So it's about buying and selling things, again, goods, but online. However, if we look at these e-commerce chapters, they are not only about buying and selling online, which itself has lots of problems. It's about really how you run your digital economy and what you think your digital economy is going to look like. So it deals with who has access to source code, whether source code is something that governments can require to be disclosed so they can investigate fraud, they can investigate collusion in the market, and source code allows us to go behind to look for biases, to look for a lot of the problems that we see with algorithms. So, and then cross-border data flows, which is something that is so important. We had a little bit of reference to it so far. Who controls data, who owns data, and how should that data be protected? Who should use it and for whom? And I think this whole area of data flow has also been a very contentious part of trade agreements in that chapter on so-called e-commerce, where the free flow, unregulated flow of data across borders has been really the push of big tech companies. And then there are chapters around what they call regulatory disciplines and transparency. What it really means is deregulation. Because anything that regulates human rights protection, labor protection, environmental protection is seen as a barrier to unfettered capital across borders. And so in the name of regulatory disciplines, facilitating trade or transparency, we see it's about, again, increasing the balance for big corporations. So what we see in these agreements really is a very simple objective. Open up economies of the South, open up data of the South today, the digitalization, open up the very lives of ourselves as producers and consumers to basically foreign companies or any company that actually has the power to grow and to corner the market and create lots of monopolies. It's as simple as that. It's about deregulating, it's about liberalizing an economy so that the bigger players can come in. And therefore, we see the concentration across all sectors. And food and agriculture, we see that happening rapidly in the last maybe 30, 40 years. So today, these agreements have moved, and it's always been, we always knew it was never just about economics. But it has become very clear in the last few years, since I think the first Trump administration in a way, but it's no longer really something whether, people still think, oh, once Mr. Trump goes away, maybe things will be better. But it doesn't matter whether it is a Republican or Democrat, party in government. It's about the system. The system is very extractive. It is very concentrating in its power. And so today we have this whole discipline of study called geoeconomics, where geopolitics meets economics. And you will see, and I'll show a little bit of that, which is what I want to focus on a little bit today, because that is driving, the foreign policy and the economic policy of big countries like the United States, and it's reshaping our rules and our relationships among ourselves. So with this background of where trade agreements have reached, we are really asking ourselves very, very fundamental questions. It also means that state sovereignty is under siege. State sovereignty, as we have all learned under international law, as a state responsibility of states in a post-World War II world where we wanted to move from violence to peace, to development, to equality, the role of the state is very important. And we have been fighting at the domestic level to have accountability, the state to be accountable to human rights, to its citizenry. And this concept of state sovereignty in terms of shaping its policies, doing what is suitable for each country. And within countries, we have such diversity. That's why we need to have citizen participation in policies of development, in lawmaking. And so the role of the state is very crucial as a defender of, as a promoter and implementer of human rights and a delivery of development. And that is under siege with these kind of agreements and economics in the finance, investment, and trade field. So the duty of states, which is fundamental to human rights, to protect human rights and to progressively implement human rights, is being rapidly eroded. Because the duty of states to implement and protect human rights means that we must be able to have the resources to do so. And today it has spread also when we talk about social, economic, and cultural rights. And this is where issues around the right to development, climate justice, intergenerational justice, these are all part of the indivisible package of human rights. But to make those human rights become real to shape our societies, and the right to development is the overarching right. We need resources. So public revenue to be generated from the wise and sustainable and fair and equitable use of our domestic resources in equitable relationship across borders is fundamental for us to be able to have the resources to deliver health, education, food sovereignty, infrastructure. And we see all this under siege because what I described earlier on in terms of the liberalization of the markets, the taking away of the right of states and peoples to put in place policies and regulations which are pro-human rights, pro-development. Taking away all that means we are just nothing but being the source and targets of extraction and just consumers. Although we always wonder, if you impoverish us in the South, who is going to be the consumer to buy your products? So this means you drive inequality. So only elites in the world, the top 1% or 0.01%, are the ones who are going to buy products for them, whether it's in health or whether it's in food. So this fundamental human rights principle of the duty of the state and the state responsibility is undermined when the ability of the state to generate its revenues, have fair trade terms across borders so that it can actually deliver development is actually undermined. And then very important principles we have fought over decades in terms of developmental rights. For example, precautionary principle, because science is not absolute. There are so many gaps in science knowledge, and recognizing the gaps in knowledge, but understanding certain decisions made when we impact and release, for example, genetically modified organisms into the environment, or we take actions where we create climate long-term impact, then we are actually creating planetary instability. So the precautionary principle, which is embedded in the UN treaties on climate, on toxics, on genetically modified organisms in biosafety, embed this very important principle, recognizing that we have lots of knowledge gaps. And now we find more and more, whether it's in climate or whether it's in biodiversity, that science itself is compromised because corporate capture of science means that we do not get proper science which are accountable and have integrity, and to be able to say we don't know. So this fight over precaution has been also a huge fight. We've had some victories, but they're being pushed back. And so we see a lot of demands in trade agreements to regulate your food standards and your environmental standards using science, which means don't use precaution. And science is also used to say, basically, in effect, you have voluntary self-regulation by corporations. So we see this happening domestically in the US, for example, which has been deregulating across the board in its food standards, in its chemical standards, in GMOs for sure. And now it's been exported through trade deals. So the other aspect which we also see being eroded is socioeconomic, cultural, religious, ethical norms, which are recognized as part of the human rights package, which recognizes and respects that in, for example, assessing whether a genetically modified plant or seed should be allowed to go into our environment, into our farms, we don't only look at so-called environmental impact or scientific knowledge. We also look at socioeconomic practices and impact. We look at cultural and religious norms. And this is embedded in the treaty, the Cartagena Treaty on Biosafety. It is embedded in many of our national laws. Again, all these that I'm talking about are seen as basically non-tariff. Tariff is what you put on taxes of goods coming into your country. These are all seen as non-tariff barriers. These are actually policy measures. Non-tariff barriers actually are very important because it means I can protect my labor. I could be protecting my environment. I can be protecting my resource from being over-mined or over-extracted. I could be setting standards of not overconsumption. I could be banning plastics, right? So by having these so-called non-tariff rules, they are part of implementing right policies and human rights. But this, from the point of view of the capitalist system, is about you are blocking my way to profiteer. And so you have to remove all these regulations, and they're seen as non-tariff barriers. So we see this happening where the standards which are being reduced in countries like the US because of the strong corporate capture is being actually globalized through trade agreements. Then there's another one principle, which is very crucial, polluter pays principle. This again is a logical thing, and this has been the basis for the rights of communities and citizens to take action against polluters and to make them pay for it. Compensation, is a very important aspect, and identifying who is a polluter is absolutely crucial. However, we now have switched over because trade agreements have actually ended up with pay the polluter. And this is most stark if you look at what the investment chapters in the trade agreements and economic partnership agreements do and what the bilateral investment agreements do, which is to give the right to private foreign investors to take a government, a state, to private, untransparent arbitration if there is a dispute. And the dispute could be very legitimately, the legitimate measure of a country could be to protect the environment, to have labor protection, or in a society which is very unequal, like what happened in South Africa, to use positive affirmative action to correct the injustice of apartheid Africa for the new independent Black South Africans. Those policies are very important, and it is a right of states to make those policies in their society. But the investor to state dispute settlement creates this right to give foreign investors that even if your measure, your policy, your law is absolutely legitimate, absolutely in line with human rights norms and international treaties, but because the effect of your government action causes the foreign investor to lose profits, and these profits could also be projected profits into the future, and they calculate what the amount is, and it can be in the billions. And these kind of conflict of interest, international lawyers in this field, today they're representing the government, tomorrow they're representing the company, the investor, and another day they're sitting as the arbitrator. And this has been documented by civil society as well, the deep conflict of interest, and this is not justice. So from polluter pays, we actually end up paying polluters. So governments taken to this process have actually had to pay billions. UNCTAD has a website where you can, for those cases which are known, you can actually see all the cases, the amount of money being claimed, and when you lose and when you do not lose if you're a state. And most of the cases, the companies, the foreign investors win. And we're talking about multi-billion-dollar payouts. So this is something that we have been pushing back, and I think that has become it is so toxic that even the United States today will not allow investor to state dispute rights given in the United States, but it doesn't stop them from pushing to have their companies sue others. Canadian companies, Australian mining companies are notorious. So you have governments that talk about human rights and women's rights and gender equality, but their mining companies, which they will protect through these agreements, will sue the last cent out of a country. And of course, the other aspect of all these agreements is the intellectual property chapter. We all thought that when the World Trade Organization, was formed and all those package of agreements took away so much policy space, introduced for the first time a global international intellectual property regime that lock us all in to give minimum 20 years patents, for example, for technologies and products, including the pharmaceutical area and including parts of nature, right? Not completely 100%, but pretty bad. So we already had it bad. But these bilateral agreements show the greed of those corporations across the board, because what they have in the World Trade Organization is still not enough. So in these bilateral agreements or regional agreements, North-South agreements, they ask for more and more very, very strict, higher so-called standards to lock in more enforcement as well. Next, please. So I'm going to quickly run to the next,
Yes.
because this is really the bulk
May I
of it, right?
request you to, take us through the rest
Yeah, so this is just
a bit
because
quickly
it's a main
because
thing.
our time.
So
Yeah.
this one, the rest are going to be very quick. So I wanted to give that background to show where we are. So human rights is really under siege. And for our purpose, because it's a WSIS period, so the area around the ecosystem of where the digital world lives. So you have minerals. The mining is where we start, all right? Because it's a key feedstock into the advanced industries in this sector. And then there's a building of digital infrastructure that includes, of course, the notorious hyper global data centers. And then, of course, it goes into the end user services. And across this whole chain, you have intensive resource use and waste across the entire ecosystem. So this is actually really the geopolitical and resource fight of the world, because this sector has very few powerful companies and the governments concerned, the host governments are actually moving very fast to lock in who controls these minerals and processing and development into the products. Next, please. So what we now have is really geoeconomics. And this, like I said, has become a whole area of study. It's really looking at how economic policies and tools are used to achieve geopolitical goals. So you would use trade, investment, sanctions, subsidies to try and exert influence on other states or territories. And I'll give you an example later. So this study and a lot of publications are coming out, and I think something we as activists need to look into more. It examines the strategic interplay between economics and power. It looks at issues of the global supply chain, technology competition, and it gives us a lot of insights into the way companies across in Europe, in North America, China coming into the picture, how they are looking at critical resources, and how this has become really the war between, the economic war between the United States and China is about the minerals, it's about the technology, it's about the supply chain. And this actually drives a lot of the rest of the world and where we fall into the supply chain. So mining and the processing of minerals, especially rare earth elements, is a huge, huge thing. So whether it is a health agreement that is being negotiated between the United States and Zambia, this came out last week. This is after you take away all the USAID money for HIV treatment, and then you come back and say, I'll give you some money, but tied to that new health agreement, you have to give me access to Zambia's minerals. And the Zambian government, for now, is saying we cannot do that. So there's a fight going on between Zambia and the United States. And then you come and see the other agreements in Asia, which is being pushed in the name of tariffs. You don't want to have punishing tariffs put on your goods you are exporting to the United States. You have to agree to come into deals with me across all these kind of things on digital issues and on the rare earths. So this is one of the most important contested areas of resource. And they're all in very sensitive ecosystems, indigenous peoples in the forest, which is a very important source of our food supply and our genetic resources, and many of even farming areas, which are very rich and very successful and are surviving. If there are minerals underneath, you are going to be in the contested spot again. Next, please. Next.
Can you just wrap up, Yokling, because
Yeah.
we're running
So
short of time.
basically, I can share this with you. I just want to end on this one. If you look at this is done by McKinsey and Company. They are advising companies how to deal with geopolitics. So if you look at the graph, the number of new international sanctions between 1949 and 2023 has shot up, right? The next one in the middle, the exported raw material products subject to export restrictions measures have gone up. This is in the thousands, right? Up to about 17, 18,000. This is, for example, the United States can say, I am restricting 200 products to this country or that country. They sign agreements with, let's say, Malaysia or Indonesia, and ask you to also follow them by applying the same restrictions of your products to that country. So this is actually a big area. And the other one is countries with investment screening, not screening investment to make sure the foreign investment does good things for your country, but screening to make sure that you do not allow investments into your country coming from a country that is a geopolitical rival of, for example, the United States. And this is what we are seeing coming up. So I just want to end here by saying that this data that if you look at what companies like McKinsey and law firms are advising their clients, is how to navigate this world. And this whole world of digital services, no services tax, no technology transfer, source code is going to be private property. This is going to cut us off from being able to have public accountability, and human rights will fall down more and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Yokling, for grounding us in ways that we cannot afford to be happy about at all. I also wanted to really, in the spirit of winding up on a positive note, I would like to return to both Sophia and yourself, and other participants have also asked this question. Maybe you can take just a couple of minutes each to say, where do you think hope lies, and what should we be doing to this kind of formal regime? How do we really redirect data and AI governance, and what do you know about what's happening in the international context, right? I mean, there is a data governance working group today that the UN has set up, and what do we think should come out of these initiatives? So to end on a positive note, over to you, Sophia, and then to you, Clay.
Yes, thank you very much, Anita. Well, in our field, I think we have seen the ingenuity, the creativity of communities is expressed, for instance, in these farming practices which are want to rehabilitate, restore ecosystems, heal ecosystems. And this is what we call agroecology, and I think that this is a practice. This is already feeding people, feeding communities. This is already healing communities, because this holistic understanding of the health of the people, but also of ecosystems and the planet, is integrated. So this is to say that all these new technologies, it will depend whether these grassroots initiatives and people organizing on the ground to defend their territories will find these technologies useful or not, for tactical purposes or for strategic purposes. We also see experiments with using these technologies for for instance, the land, protection of lands. Of course, it is alternative uses of these technologies are possible. The question remains to what extent we will be still depending on the infrastructure of these big technical corporations. I came back some days ago from Panama. So I was working in remote islands in the Caribbean with the Kuna indigenous peoples, who have a very militant history of defending their territory back to 100 years ago, with a strong autonomy recognized by the Panama state. But what I saw was, when we were talking about these issues, all of them use Starlink. There is no other way to communicate in remote areas without the Starlink. So this is, I think, one of our biggest problems, the infrastructure problem, that we rely on the infrastructure of these big corporations. And now the question is whether we can really move our states to put in place an infrastructure which is controlled by us and by our states. So this is, of course, probably a dream, because just few countries in the South are in the capacity of doing so. Perhaps India, perhaps Brazil. We heard some encouraging news during the COP30 in Brazil that, for instance, the cadastre for environment and rural lands, which I was referring to, is entirely controlled by Brazil. So this is certainly, in a sense, good news, but not all countries are in a position to do that for the moment, particularly given the financial constraints that Jacqueline was referring to, right? So a country like Zambia, which is indebted in a big debt crisis, is going to be very difficult, right, without the proper financial resources to do so. So, but I think it remains very important to keep the awareness about that we need to be very tactical about that, and push for really public control, for collective data rights, so that we can exercise our right to self-determination also when it comes to the use of this data, and to decide what are the technologies and the infrastructure that we need.
Well, I think the issue of data, I think there were also a couple of questions in the chat box. I think people are becoming aware now. I think enough work and things are happening, so there's a growing awareness that this data is being misappropriated. So right now at the international level, there are fights going on, and I think more people should join that fight. For example, Anita, you mentioned the UN having the digital the data sort of process, but there are three treaties where three places where this is actually being fought out at the moment, about the data, about data centers, about benefit sharing, about governance, and about accountability. So we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which actually has been there since 1992, and it recognized that natural resources, genetic resources, indigenous peoples, local communities, it recognized that whole set of biopiracy challenges. Of course, with genetic information and DSI and data, it has actually been a multi-year fight for us to even get a decision, and we did, that it would also also, of course, logically include DSI. So it's not just the physical material, because today you don't need the physical material, you're still bioparity. So I think there is a fight going on there, and the Nagayo Protocol, which is specifically on benefit sharing, has been pushing to deal with this whole issue of ownership and benefit sharing. We also have the WHO, where the new treaty, the pandemic treaty that was adopted in May of this year, has now the system on access and benefit sharing of pathogens, of microorganisms, is now being very much fought out. And it's the same debate, databases, in most of it which are in Europe or in North America, but the material is coming from the South. How do you do the sharing? And corporations are using it. So that, again, is a set of the battles of these principles. And of course, the FAO Treaty on Seeds has a multilateral system of sharing, seeds, because sharing and exchanging seeds has been millennial, right, at the local level and also across borders. But now it's becoming more and more privatized. So I think the seed treaty itself is having this big debate. And in Peru, just a few weeks ago, there was a big attempt to expand the scope of the treaty to cover all genetic resources for food and agriculture, not just the 64 in the treaty. But if we have biopiracy, digitalization, and what we talked about happening, and no counterforce of governance, accountability, and benefit sharing, and the role at the center of it of people, of communities, of farmers and indigenous peoples, then we cannot expand the scope. And I think we managed to stop that with some governments coming in, right? So I think those are signs that the fight is on, but we need to bring more people together. And I took a little bit of time just to talk about the agreements, because we cannot work in silos anymore. And we are beginning to cross silos. The work you do in IT for Change and in the digital rights community is really so linked to what we've been fighting for so long on food justice, food sovereignty, climate justice, right? Energy for people, and of course, the trade agreement. So we are coming together, and that is very hopeful. And I think we need to come together, and the players, and really expose. There's so much good research on following the companies. And today we're also following the equity funds and the finance institutions, which we didn't do so much before. So BlackRock should be the center of a huge global campaign, because they have the most private money and they are really shaping everything in our lives. So I am very optimistic. I think we need to organize ourselves. We need to share so much of the good information, and then we need to think about how to work together from the very local level to the global coalitions.
Thank you for leaving us on that optimistic note. And I think that from learning through a tour around our historical successes of social movements and campaigns, to juxtaposing those insights on the data and digital debate, I think there is a lot of homework to be done there. I think this panel, we managed to infiltrate, I think, the digital conversations in a very, very important way. And I thank everybody who came here. And we do think that the summary of this will be carried by the WSIS Plus 20 process. We see this itself as an important formal recognition that the digital is not disembedded from society. And indeed, if it is a vehicle of inequality, then we must question what kind of digital do we need that can actually enhance and amplify all our rights in their integrated and indivisible form. On that note, I'd like to really thank everybody, especially those who have contributed resources on the chat. We will record this and probably keep in touch with you on the next steps. Thank you very much, Sophia. Thank you, Yokling.
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.